Just last month, we talked about the first Chronicles of Narnia book. Yet many fans found or rediscovered C.S. Lewis's series thanks to the Disney-distributed Walden Media made film from director Andrew Adamson. Want to feel old? That was 2 decades ago. You're welcome. So now we shall look back at Narnia's journey to the box office with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe and a chap who helped get this film off the ground before that film released 20 years ago on December the 9th, 2005.
Speculative fiction, like no other genre, reflects the creativity of God.
If you look at the scriptures, you're going to have to see that God uses imagination more than rational discourse.
We are supposed to be image bearers for a vastly creative God.
Reading fantastical fiction opened a portal in my imagination for a place other than just a materialistic world.
I experienced the gospel story with the mind of someone who loved adventure and loved the idea of light conquering darkness.
We're wired for stories that reflect how we see the world in ways that are true.
The story is either pointing to Christ or it's pointing to our need for Christ.
Well, that opening isn't rock and roll, but we still hope you think this podcast is cool. Fantastical Truth, the podcast from Lorehaven.com, whose mission is to explore fantastical stories for God's glory. I'm me, Stephen Burnett, big Narnia fan since childhood, co-host of this podcast, publisher of Lorehaven, and the author of Above the Circle of Earth, a sci-fi novel that launched earlier this year about space missionaries from Enclave Publishing.
And I'm Zackary Russell, and it got below 40 degrees here in Texas, so I am desperately looking for a wardrobe full of fur coats. And this is episode 291. 20 years ago, how did the first Narnia theatrical film get made? And we are going to get a lot of great answers to that question from our guest today, Mark Joseph, in just a few minutes.
That's as cool as it gets in Central Texas. But if we did replace our opening with rock and roll soundtrack, I'm sure that we would be even cooler. We'd get even more numbers listening. Hello, all you wonderful people. And maybe you actually saw that news last week where I think it was a Netflix guy, and Netflix is irritating a lot of people right now. I was already annoyed with him because he went out and reinforced a quote from another executive saying that the Magician's Nephew movie on Netflix from Greta Gerwig is going to have a rock and roll inspired soundtrack because this isn't your grandmother's or mother's Narnia. It's going to be all edgy, and we're going to have inspiration from Pink Floyd and The Doors and all that cool music for cool, happening cats. Zach, what was your visceral response hint when you saw this news? We got to address it going in here.
It's impossible to separate my feelings from that, from my feelings from the first movie. And it just hit me, Stephen, that the first Narnia movie coming out 20 years ago was a year before our oldest daughter was born. And so, that was in a very different era, I feel like, of filmmaking. And now we're in the era of every film seems so not just controversial, but adversarial. Like it seems like a lot of films are made with no respect or consideration or even no love for the fans that they're supposedly being made for. But that wasn't the feeling 20 years ago when Narnia first came to the screen. And, our guest today is going to talk about how there were partnerships all around, partnerships between the Lewis estate and film studios, between a Christian entertainment group and Disney, between secular fans and Christian fans. And so it just feels like a different world 20 years ago than what is happening right now.
At least there was the intent in the making of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. The actual results may vary. I've often said that I really like the film, but I don't love the film. Like I love the Lord of the Rings films, for example. And one way or another, those really are the benchmark standard for what we expect in adaptations of Lewis's or Tolkien's work. So I will say that unless there's some take back from this quote that got out there, along with this nonsense that we talked about a few months ago, Zach, about the idea of Aslan being voiced by a female actor, unless there's an immediate take back from this, or it ends up being some sort of false flag designed to make us irritated, and then we get less irritated by less invasive changes, then I'm opposed to this project. I hate saying that, but this story and all of the Chronicles of Narnia are so dear to me that I will become, in a sense, an enemy of this project, and I will hope for it to fail. And I would actively discourage people from supporting this, even out of some morbid curiosity. Now, please, Netflix, I know you're listening because, we're selling out to you tomorrow, right? I know Netflix is going to buy everybody and we're all just going to be content drones, but please change this. This is just one too many supposed change, too far. It clashes with the spirit, the ideas, the themes of The Magician's Nephew. We'll be talking about this, Zach and I, hopefully on an X space pretty soon, maybe even this week. So watch lorehaven.com for more information about that. But on top of this, it's just a dumb decision, even just creatively, apart from Lewis and The Magician's Nephew and all that. We have already been making fun of needle drop moments in trailers and in movies. We're sick of it. We're sick of y'all trying to make everything seem cool because you bring back the stuff y'all thought cool. This is lame-o boomer youth pastor energy here. How do you do, fellow kids? Guys, don't do it. Don't do this, fellow kids. This is the absurdist, the extreme. It literally feels like a parody at this point.
Yeah, I really wish all movie producers would be forced to watch some kind of documentary that doesn't exist, but some kind of retelling of what happened with the Wheel of Time series on Amazon Prime that was unceremoniously canceled after 3 seasons for a book series that's 14 books, and how it so divided the fans. Like, there were just enormous battles between fans that said, hey, we really want a faithful adaptation, versus the fans that wanted everything to be modernized and a big stick in the eye to people they didn't like. And then the studio started taking sides, and then, it was just this horrible PR campaign for the show. And supposedly, production-wise, it got better. Story-wise, it got further apart. I gave up in the middle of season 2. That is a cautionary tale that I feel like everyone should learn from. Like, you don't have to make the same mistake of alienating your core fan base. Like, there are ways where you can still be creative and you can still do some fun and new things, but without making a mess of it. That's what we hope for here. I know, Stephen, you're vowing already to become an enemy. I'm just trying to be a peacemaker wherever I can. Please just listen to the wisdom of what has happened before.
I'm generally a more optimistic person, and this is the third strike for me. That doesn't mean you lost the game entirely. There's still a chance to earn me back and thousands of other fans. I will just say to any listening producers, we are not alone, and we are the fan base. There is no modern audience who's going to resonate with The Magician's Nephew more than us. Backtrack now, or be destroyed. But for a more positive take on The Magician's Nephew from Netflix, you will want to head to lorehaven.com for a new article last week from Daniel White IV. Now, this is a very positive piece, which makes a strong case as to why the time shift of The Magician's Nephew from the turn of the 20th century setting to more the 1950s setting could actually work out well. And he actually brings in the example of Del Toro's Frankenstein adaptation, which had a similar time shift, to say, you know what, by jumping it forward half a century in the setting, you can actually do some interesting things with the material that end up doubling down on the original themes, in Daniel's view, rather than dismissing them. I hope he's right, because I also don't like the time shift, because the ramifications are terrible for the Lion, the Witch, and Wardrobe adaptation, which takes place about 40 years later. That would push it into, God forbid, the 90s, and just perish the thought. I would be even more of an enemy at that point, because it just does not work for the virtues of the children and the cultural influences of Narnia and C.S. Lewis himself. Subscribe free, by the way, and you'll get updates from lorehaven.com. And also, this is important, you want better stories that aren't so deconstructive, or so it seems, we'll send you the invitation for the Lorehaven Guild, which is about to get even more interesting starting in January 2026, Lord willing. That's our Discord castle in the cloud on that platform. And starting in January, we're starting a new book quest through Stephen Lawhead's pre-medieval fantasy Taliesin, soon to be part of an adaptation from Daily Wire Plus that we hope will be more faithful to not just Taliesin, but also Merlin. Great series there. I think it's 5, maybe 6 books now. I've only read those first 2, but our volunteers are going to take you through that first book, Taliesin, at the Lorehaven Guild. Another story that we can recommend is even older than Lawhead's take, but inspired a lot of fantasy, and that's from Oasis Family Media, and specifically their Sky Turtle imprint. Journey back to a forgotten world that inspired generations of fantasy writers. Welcome to Spencer's Grand Adventure, a tale that inspired generations of fantasy writers, but is now accessible to all. Many have attempted to read this, Edmund Spenser's 1590s epic, The Fairy Queen, only to be discouraged by language that is even more difficult than Shakespeare's. Now, educator Rebecca K. Reynolds, previous guest of the show, by the way, presents a text-faithful prose rendering that gradually introduces Spenser's distinctive vocabulary, preparing readers to engage confidently with the original text. Zach already got his out. I have been waiting to unbox mine, hopefully on social media. So Zach's got it, and he's showing it right here, and it is indeed magnificent. The Fairy Queen by Edmund Spenser, richly illustrated by fantasy artist Justin J.R.R. This 3-volume set shares the adventures of knights who confront monsters, wizards, enchantresses, and their own weaknesses. Prince Arthur also seeks his love, Gloriana, the elusive Fairy Queen. Sky Turtle Press presents Edmund Spenser's The Fairy Queen, a prose rendering, a text-faithful translation of the 1590s epic poem by Rebecca K. Reynolds, available next week, December 16th, wherever fantastic books are sold. Ask for The Fairy Queen at your favorite bookseller or your local library, or order it online from Amazon.com. It is also available as an audiobook, masterfully narrated by Simon Vance from Oasis Audio. I'm looking forward to reading this. What a wonderful addition to the bookshelf. Yes, I got mine. Yes, Oasis is a sponsor, but I would love this sort of thing anyway. And we did an episode about that with Rebecca K. Reynolds. Find the link in the show notes for a story that is even older than Narnia, and by the way, without which we would not have Lewis's work or Tolkien's work. So a lot of people who want to adapt his work for the modern age maybe need to go back and study them up some chivalry, as presented by Spenser and other classic authors. Speaking of old and good ancient things, I hear a telltale rumble from outside. I don't think it's a motorized contraption that is bringing in our next guest, so we're going to have to open the wide doors to receive now Mark Joseph. Mark Joseph has just stormed into the studio in his 4-horse open chariot straight from the set of Ben-Hur. He is a music and film producer, author, columnist, founder of MJM Entertainment Group. He got his start in television as an anchor. He's produced his own films. He oversees a marketing team that has marketed 75 films since 2001, including for Walden Media and Crusader Entertainment. And Walden Media, they were the ones who made The Chronicles of Narnia, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe back in 2005. He's the author of 4 books, including The Lion, The Professor, and The Movies, Narnia's Journey to the Big Screen, and has contributed to many publications like The Hollywood Reporter, Variety, and USA Today, and many others. And he's currently a senior columnist for Newsweek and hosts the Mark Joseph Show, a podcast. Most recently, he produced the film Reagan, starring Dennis Quaid as the president, and published a book about that as well, and produced the film's 2 soundtracks. He and his wife, Kara, have 6 children and reside in Southern California. And right now, Mark Joseph temporarily resides with us. So, Mark, glad you can make it.
Hey, guys, great to be with you. By the way, Crusader Entertainment, I wonder if that would be called just Crew if it were alive today. just dawned on me that we should probably shorten that.
Well, we've copyrighted that now with Campus Crusade, being Crew now, but yes.
Guys, when I first went to work for Crusader, I was joking around saying, listen, as long as we're reminding people of the greatest times in our history, why don't we just call ourselves Inquisition Entertainment while we're at it?
Oh, based but controversial. I like that energy. Mark, so glad you could make it. And Narnia for you. Now, that's been in the news this past week. There was a little leak, not really a leak, kind of a reinforcement of an old quote about how the magician's nephew was going to be inspired by rock and roll. It was going to be really edgy. How do you do, fellow kids? Now, I don't think you're marketing this movie, but given that you had a heavy hand in the previous film, I wonder what your take is on that. Is Is rock and roll going to make Narnia cool, the magician's nephew, really hip with the hip kids?
I spent a lot of time in Japan. There's a Japanese phrase that says the line between genius and stupidity is the width of a human hair. And so this could be either really amazing or really horrific. I just don't know which it's going to be. But I don't think it'll be either. It'll be anywhere in the middle of those two.
The thing that's strange about that line about this is not your grandmother's rock and roll, but then they reference Pink Floyd and the Doors. I'm like, I'm pretty sure that's what my grandma listened to around.
Well, they
that
said
time,
this is not
so.
your grandmother's Narnia, and most people, including many grandmothers, said, I want my grandmother's Narnia. Like what? Literally, Lewis starts The Magician's Nephew saying this is a story that took place long ago when your grandfather was a child, which makes sense if you are the original readers in the 1950s, early 60s. Not so much now. So maybe that's why they're shifting the setting forward, apparently, to the 1950s per the set photos. But that and this rock and roll idea and the earlier notion that Aslan, male or female, was going to be voiced by Meryl Streep has got a lot of fans on edge right now. So what think you, Mark Joseph, of these particular marketing decisions?
Yeah, there's really just a grave danger always has been with a property like this. I don't even know where to start, but there's so many issues that you've brought up there in one sentence. But ultimately, the first and foremost, you have to remember the fans of any kind of property like this. And certainly with myself and even the Reagan movie, I was very, very cognizant of the hardcore fans. If you don't take care of your fans, you have nothing, because you have to first and foremost take care of the fans and then build out from there to other groups. I mean, it's kind of like a political campaign. Imagine if you're Bernie Sanders and you're running for president, and you tick off all of your core fan base of strong progressives and try to reach other people. Well, that's not going to work. You have to first, if you're Bernie Sanders, you first take care of your base and you say, I want $100 an hour minimum wage or whatever it might be. And then you reach out to more moderate or even conservative voters. But you don't start off by ticking off your home base. And so I think that's always been a problem with Narnia. In the various attempts that were made over the years, and I talk about this in my book, in the earlier incarnations, there were attempts to replace Turkish Delight with cheeseburgers, have Janet Jackson play the Wicked Witch. I mean, just things that are just mind-bogglingly stupid that would have ticked off fans. And so, as far as I'm my professional opinion that I can't prove, so I think you have to say allegedly, I would wager, if I were a betting man in Las Vegas, that story about Meryl Streep was leaked on purpose to try to gauge fan reaction. And I think the fans, from what I can tell, gave their reaction. They weren't terribly pleased with it. It has nothing to do with sexism or not liking women. It's just about, this is not the way Lewis wrote it. And I remember, having been involved since the early days of Narnia in 2000, I probably shouldn't say who, but a very important person on the team was fond of saying that C.S. Lewis is a sexist, and he was going to have the girls fight in battle. And my response was like, well, then why are you on this project? If you think this book was written by a sexist person, why would you ever want to be involved with something so horrible? So rather than change it, let's go with the author's intent here. In terms of the big picture, yes, stay as true as you can to the original work. Obviously, you can make changes and adaptations and do things interestingly here. And the thing is, people will allow you to do some different things if they trust you. The really important part, if we trust the filmmaker and his or her intent, then people will be okay with some slight variations. Just to give you one example, on The Passion of the Christ, because the viewers trusted Mel Gibson and his intentions, they let him get away with all kinds of crazy things that are not in the Bible. Mary's telling Jesus, go set the table, and Jesus is splashing water on her, and all kinds of, Jesus Satan has a child. If you remember, Satan's got this creepy child on his shoulder.
Baby. Yeah.
Right. Now, if the viewers didn't trust Mel Gibson's intentions, they'd be very upset with variations like that. But because they trust him, or even Dallas Jenkins in The Chosen, when you trust the filmmaker, and that trust is really important and it's earned. I don't think Greta Gerwig has that trust at all at this point, just because of her body of work. So she needs to be very, very careful not to betray that trust. And just to give you one example on The Passion of the Christ, we had a preacher come in to watch the movie think he was a pretty prominent person. And, he told Mel, afterwards, he said, now, what is this about, Satan having a baby, and Mel's like, Mel was just like, well, I thought it'd be kind of cool. He goes, God has Jesus and Satan's a kind of a copycat. I thought it'd be kind of fun to give him a kid. And the preacher was indignant. What verse of what chapter of what book in the Bible does it say Satan has a child? And Mel goes, I just pulled out of my rear end. And the pastor was kind of horrified. But the point is, because they trusted his intent, they're not going to quibble with little things. If they don't trust the intent, they will very much quibble about little things.
I always read that scene as Satan mocking Jesus, like kind of mocking the mother-child relationship. And Satan there is actually played by a woman, so he's also mocking the division between men and women that God has established in the created order with this androgynous appearance. So I see where you're coming from there. I think it absolutely matters that people trust the director. And at this point, I think there's a lot of people who do trust Greta Gerwig because they've liked her previous movies. But I have not seen, a whole lot of love specifically for Narnia for what it is, a celebration of virtue, a celebration of what's good about the old things, a celebration of Aslan in particular. Now, maybe she does feel that way, and maybe it's the marketing in the way right now. I suppose we will just have to see. But speaking of trust, Mark, I'd love to know, before we get to chapter 1, actually, talking about the Narnia's journey from the book to screen, what got you into this business? Like, particularly, what introduced you to Christ and to fantastical stories and the making and marketing of them after that?
I grew up overseas, so I'm the American guy, 2 American parents who grew up in Japan. Parents were missionaries there. So, I grew up basically 2 or 3 miles from the origin place of anime, which is the Toei Film Studios in Tokyo. It's interesting. It's kind of a walled compound. And so you really couldn't get in. You could kind of peek over the edges if you wanted to, but that's kind of where the birthplace of anime, basically. So I've kind of got that in my blood. And of course, growing up with all the great Japanese directors and watching, really cut my teeth on Japanese television, Japanese film. So that's a huge kind of part of my journey. But also just, I think, combining those 2 worlds. I have missionary parents who are trying to spread the good word. And yet I noticed a lot of missionaries were really not very cognizant of media. And they had strategies that were sort of developed in 1874, whenever it was, by Hudson Taylor in China. And, it's always good to kind of update our paradigms every once in a while. And so when you can push a button and send a message around the world, you probably need to adjust strategies developed when there were ships and things like that. So anyway, all that just always gave me a passion for communicating through stories. Not incidentally, the founder of the Christian faith was a person who often told stories to average fishermen and brought theological concepts down to very simple stories. And so I think C.S. Lewis in our time is really the master of that. And he famously said you can smuggle a lot of theology into stories. I've just had a kind of a varied career in TV and film and books and music and kind of all different forms of communication. So with all that as a backdrop, I really got thrust into the Narnia situation at about 2000 when I went to work for Walden Media and Crusader Entertainment, which were both owned by Philip Anschutz, the Denver billionaire. And one of the first things that my then boss told me was in the docket was that we're going to obtain the rights to Narnia from the estate. When I first joined, I think we were about 6 months away from the rights reverting back to the estate from Kathleen Kennedy. And so we were kind of in this crouching, quiet mode of waiting out the clock for the rights to expire and then pouncing. It was a very strange time because there was a Christian television network who I shall not identify exactly, but as I was just kind of trying to feel the landscape out, I reached out and I said, we're thinking about acquiring this series, and have you guys heard of the Chronicles of Narnia? We just wanted to kind of make contact. And this person who was VP of the network said, I've never heard of the Chronicles of Narnia. And then he said, he came back and he said, I've talked to my board members, and none of us have ever heard of the Chronicles of Narnia. And I was just really, really in shock. And so I prepared a goodie bag of 5 different books on theology of the Chronicles of Narnia. I sent down like 3 sets of it to them, hoping they would familiarize themselves with it. At the same time, the secular world also wasn't terribly aware of Narnia or C.S. Lewis. So it was this odd time where it seemed like both sides, for different reasons, were not terribly aware of it. So kind of a strange thing. But my first order of business beyond that stuff was I really had a passion for Disney to be our partner. And the reason is I didn't want, having grown up in an extremely secular culture where ideas and books and movies are often not allowed in if they come with a religious banner. I was really keen on having it come under the Disney brand around the world, both in terms of very secular cultures, let's say Europe and Asia and Japan, but also maybe Muslim countries where maybe there'd be a problem if it came under a religious banner. So I really wanted to be with Disney. I would say that at the time, the natural trajectory probably would have been Fox just because of Rupert Murdoch and Phil Anschutz. But I had a friend at Disney named Ned Lott, 2 friends, Ned Lott and Rick Dempsey. And Rick in particular was the senior vice president of character voices. But more significantly, Rick was one of 3 people that Disney had appointed to be on a special committee to maintain the integrity of the Disney brand. I think it was him, Roy Disney, and one other person. And so I went to Rick and I just said, I really want Aslan to be with you guys. And how can we do this? And so Rick went to his boss, Dick Cook, president of Disney, and he said, really, these guys want to work with us. And Dick's attitude was, as it came back to me, was, this property's been around for a long time, 50 years. And I don't know, he sort of said, it's probably not for us, but you're fine to talk with those guys and see if there's anything there. If it was kind of that kind of an attitude, that was all that Rick and I needed, was basically a permission slip to really get the relationship going. We arranged for basically our bosses to meet up. And that would be like Mark Zorati and Dick Cook meeting with my bosses at the time, Michael Flaherty and others. And so from there, we kind of handed off the baton to them. And, they took it from there. And so we were a little bit less involved after that. But it was just the initial engine that I just really wanted to see Aslan be part of the Disney family, Mickey and Minnie and Daffy and Aslan. I really foresaw a long relationship that didn't really happen. But, I was hoping for a Narnia, rides at Disney and just really a full embrace that didn't quite happen the way I was hoping for.
Now, that would have been intriguing. And we did get 2 Narnia films from Walden Media, but distributed by Disney. I think a lot of people think of them as Disney films, but I was pretty involved, at least with keeping up with the news there in the early 2000s, as soon as some of those really insider tips started leaking out. Still the early days of the internet, by the way, when fan communities were growing. And I joined the Narnia web forum almost as soon as it got started. And we were all over the news, including some very early casting rumors and such. But until then, there had only been 2 real visual adaptations of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe specifically. There was a TV animated movie in 1979. A lot of people still remember that, kind of a modernized version. And then the story plus 2 more. There were TV serials. The second one combined Prince Caspian and The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. But the first one was The Lion, the Witch, and Wardrobe on the live-action BBC television starting in 1988. So then Walden Media comes along, Philip Anschutz, I remember him, and they wanted to do this kind of family entertainment with specifically an eye towards bringing to life these classic works of literature with their visual adaptations. So I remember they did Holes, they did Because of Winn-Dixie, and they started to get a little traction. But Narnia, if I remember right, that was going to be the big one. And it finally became official. And I even remember seeing there was a New York Times full-page advertisement. I think it was December 2003. I still have that on my Narnia shelf because, of course, I have a C.S. Lewis shrine. Because I'm the publisher of Lorehaven. You have to have at least one kind of shrine while still worshiping Jesus Christ. You can have a shrine for someone else. It's okay. It's allowed. But it's great to hear that you were instrumental in those very early stages then. And by the way, we're already into chapter 1, Narnia's journey from book to screen. It's not like you made the movie or cast or did the music, but without you and these other folks having those early conversations, we would not have The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. released 20 years ago. What was your job title, and what role did you have, like getting like stuff signed and like those early screenplays? Like, what do you remember from some of the early scripts that were going on? There was a rumor that there was going to be a modernized version, for example, with the kids are going to leave Los Angeles. I don't know why. Smog evacuations. I don't know. And then the White Witch was going to tempt Edmund with an enchanted hot dog. Was there ever any merit to those rumors, or was it just early fan scuttlebutt?
Yeah. I worked for the presidents of both Walden and Crusader. So they were sort of sister companies that were both owned by Phil. But in like true old-fashioned British style, you'd have your two children competing against each other and see who would, decimate the other. So ultimately, Walden sort of won that battle because Crusader went under just after it won the Oscar for Ray, the Ray Charles movie. I worked for both, and in a way, I became a producer because of the frustration of that time period for me, which was originally my job was to help develop materials and then to market it once it was done. I didn't have much of a say in the actual production. And it was just really frustrating because I would see just critical mistakes being made in the production of it. And I'd be handed this turkey at the end and they would say, go market this, and I go, well, wait a minute. I can't market this, because you guys made these mistakes in the production of it. So I think after all these experiences, I really stepped back and realized that I had to jump back in, even though I'm fairly lazy. So I don't really want to produce a movie, but if I have to, then I have to. And so that's what kind of put me more on the producer track. But just to give you one example, on the Ray Charles movie, I read the script and had made some notes, but I didn't have any real power to change anything or do anything. And yet once it was done, they would say, okay, Mark, we want you to go market this to the churches. And I would say, well, here's the problem, you guys. In this movie, you have Ray Charles, his wife comes to him and says, honey, you've got to go to church. And Ray Charles literally says, F the church, I'm going to rehab. So let me get this straight. You want me to market something to a group that you just said F them to? Like, that makes no sense.
Market it to the rehab centers, I guess. Apparently he liked them better, at least in the movie version.
Right. So that's kind of when I was like, okay, this just isn't going to work. Not that I can't ever market something that's, but I need to have, more of a say. And so that's when I realized that I have to be more involved in the process. So with the Reagan, for instance, then that's really, I was able to have a hand in all phases of it, from development to production to marketing. And then it's much more easier. I guess that's where the Narnia thing would come in, because I didn't have the title of producer. Basically, all of us at the company were not allowed to have a producer title. So even though somebody like a Michael Flaherty, who was very, very involved as the president of Walden, he doesn't have a producer title. So because I didn't have that kind of title, I wasn't able to, certain things we couldn't do. As an example, with that one, I got the second or third draft of the script, and you'll never believe this, but the kids were dropping F-bombs with each other and cursing like sailors. And again, it's just another example of, guys, this is crazy. I think I wrote in the margins of the screenplay, have we lost our minds? We can't have these sweet British children cursing like sailors. Hollywood's a weird place, and people sometimes, for reasons of their own childhood and upbringing, they like to not just modernize, but just really change the characters, and in a desire to be relevant. That's always a temptation in this town, for the writer especially. So, that's an example where it was so over the top that probably didn't need my voice, but definitely I contributed my voice and, said we can't have this for for this series. And so that definitely changed. By the time you all saw it, there wasn't Susan and Lucy and Edmund saying bad words to each other.
Which is just such an obvious thing, right? I'm a parent and I've got kids, and I would not want them to watch a movie like that anyway, much less Narnia, which is so near and dear to our family. It's just great that, you, from the marketing end, getting to be there in the pre-production and saying, how are we going to market something that's already way off base? Like, which audience are we really chasing? And it's, as you said, you have to have that core fandom along and then expand from there, rather than like ignore them or subvert them. I just have never really understood from a business sense why a lot of movies nowadays are made that way.
Yeah, I think on that front, it's very important. How do you view your audience and your fans? If I were Greta Gerwig, I would invite 100 of Narnia's most diehard fans and put them up in a hotel in Universal City and sit in a room with them for a weekend and just listen. Listen, 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 listen. You can't go wrong listening to your fans, your customers. And this is a business, after all. If you view your viewers as stupid people who need to be updated and need to teach them some sophistication, you'll have one product. If you view those fans as people I need to really listen to understand these people have lived the story for 30 years and they're hanging out at Narnia Web and this is their life. I want to listen to them and understand their hopes and their fears and their dreams. So it's really two different attitudes, and I've encountered both in Hollywood. Primarily, the attitude is you people are morons, and our job is to make something that will expand your limited universe sitting in your mom's basement. That's generally the attitude. I think it's a giant mistake. Never forget when Darren Aronofsky made the Noah movie, and it was getting really, really bad test scores in the test screenings. And his response was, "I'm above test scores." And I'm thinking, really? Wow. I wish I had thought of that line when I was in 6th grade and I was failing a test. I should have gone to my teacher and said, "I'm above test scores because I'm Mark Joseph." Well, that's not the way the world works in school or at work or anywhere. It's just a weird part of Hollywood that people think they're above test scores.
Well, and that's not the American way. We're a meritocracy, not an aristocracy, or at least we should be. And it doesn't really work out when it goes the other way. So when you were talking earlier about in the early 2000s, working with the Lewis estate, trying to get the rights to the movies, and there was that process with other producers having the rights and waiting for those to revert. I understand there's probably a ton of legal stuff there that, we can't really go into. But what I am curious about is what were the types of things that the Lewis estate was attracted to in terms of a script or a production process? Like, because as I understand it, the movie itself was considered unfilmable for the longest time, even by Lewis himself. Like, how are you going to make a talking lion on the screen? And obviously, special effects evolved over time. But what were some of the things that made them go, maybe this would work? What were they looking for, I guess?
With regard to Disney, first of all, one of the key things was to have Douglas Gresham, C.S. Lewis's stepson, overcome the kind of natural loathing that C.S. Lewis and Camp had of Disney or for Disney. Lewis had famously written how much he did not like Disney. I think he'd watched Snow White and did not like it at all. So there's this kind of natural cultural antipathy for the Disney culture. And so a huge part of that was Rick Dempsey at Disney, who was a strong person of faith. And so really when I think I put him and Doug Gresham together and they went off and spent time together. And, Rick basically said to Doug, "Listen, I'm here for this reason. I've been given this position to literally, I'm one of the 3 keepers of the Disney brand. So let's do this together." And I think that really gave Doug Gresham the comfort level to say, okay, I'm going to get over whatever we have against Disney. And I trust Rick. I trust these guys. I trust the Walden guys. And so that really helped, I think, to create that level of trust. And then Doug had a really strong hand in everything. He was able to veto things that were, dumb. He was able to suggest things. And basically, I think he was the keeper of the flame on behalf of his stepfather. I've heard that he's not doing very well health-wise right now. So he may not be in a position to do that now in this situation. But he certainly was at that stage, really kept a lot of good things to happen and kept some dumb things from happening.
Even more than just the whether we put a cheeseburger in place of a Turkish delight or have curse words. It's about having those relationships that are built on trust and respect. And everything kind of flows from that. And I think that's what always makes art so good, that collaborative art has to be a partnership, and it has to be that, real friendship of like pursuing common interests rather than like you said, a competition between different people.
That's really true. And just even thinking back to, that time period, we talked about the rock and roll thing at the beginning, and I have one confession. It could be, if it's done right, it could be good. And just in this case, I remember there was a band called Lifehouse, and I said, I found out from Jason Wade, I think I'd brought him, we had working on something else, and I found out he was a huge Narnia fan. So I sent Jason out to meet with Doug Gresham. Jason came back and he wrote a song called Dear Mr. Tumnus. that was a very, it wasn't a rock and roll song. It was more of a mellow ballad. It never got used, unfortunately, even though I tried. But there is some room there for artistic interpretation. And, having produced the soundtracks, the inspired by soundtracks for Reagan and for The Passion of the Christ, I love the idea of how are musical artists inspired by film artists, and what do they write in response to it. So I do love that. Again, that's why it could be great or it could be horrible, depending on how it comes out.
I like what you said earlier, Mark, about it really being about trust of the director and the other folks overseeing the project. We're okay with them doing some experimental stuff if we trust them already. And sometimes I think folks will just stumble into mistrust, and then they will start even misreading the director's intentions or the actual results on the screen, not because it was bad necessarily, but because that trust has been broken. And then all of a sudden you'll feel a rather visceral, ugh, in response to the name of, like, for example, a particular producer who you name checked earlier, who apparently had the rights to Narnia beforehand. And suddenly we're thinking about the parallel possibilities there. But that's another podcast episode. I'll talk in a moment about that after our next sponsor, which is author Vince Mancuso with his fantasy, A Fae Tale. Looking for a fantasy your young reader won't want to put down and you'll actually feel good about them reading? In a Fae Tale, magical creatures have revealed themselves and claimed the world as their own. Floating cities hang in the skies, Fae lords govern the earth, and one law binds mankind: no human may wield magic. When 12-year-old Isla Cosgrave's outlawed power awakens, she's thrust into a conflict that spans Fae queens, dwarves, and human outcasts, each with secrets of their own. Isla may be the key to uncovering the truth and shaping the future of both worlds. A Fae Tale, spelled Faie, by Vince Mancuso, is available now on Amazon, and you can see that whimsical, fantastical cover and more info in our show notes for this episode 291. Go to lorehaven.com/podcast for more. Chapter 2, Through the Winter of Production. And we may spend a little less time here because there's been so much podcast time and article time, I think even on this show, devoted to how The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe got made under the oversight of director Andrew Adamson, who was pretty famous at that point for doing visual effects for some of the Batman movies, as well as, at least infamously to Narnia fans at the time, the director of the first two Shrek movies. And there were early rumors, Mark, you probably would have known, that, oh, they're going to make Narnia a fartin' action comedy because you pigeonhole a guy like Andrew Adamson, unfairly, I think, in retrospect, especially, as, oh, he wants to make everything a flippant comedy that deconstructs fairy tale tropes rather than affirms fairy stories like Lewis did. Adamson did a fantastic job from all indications. And the final scriptwriters that they had, Stephen Marcus and Andrew Marcus and McFeely, I forget their first names, but they later went on to do Captain America movies and then Avengers movies. So they got their start, really, their big break with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And we were following along with the casting, especially for the children. And Brian Cox was originally going to be the voice of Aslan. He bowed out. There was an early rumor about Nicole Kidman playing the White Witch. I think that ended up discredited, but Tilda Swinton did a fantastic job, and she liked it so much she even came back for the next two movies somehow. Mark, at that point, how were you involved in some of these decisions, if any, or was it more just, hey, you got the ball rolling and now let's let these other trusted creators take it from here?
No, I had a chance to speak into all that stuff, and I unsuccessfully lobbied for Mel Gibson to be the voice of Aslan. Really, I did it based on, I was working with him on The Passion of the Christ, and I heard a documentary. You guys can check it out. He did a documentary called The Face, and it was a documentary about the face of Jesus in art through the centuries. And I really loved his voice in that documentary. And so I went to him and I said, would you ever consider, if you were asked, would you be the voice of Aslan? He said, yeah, sure. So I went back to the team and they all said, you're crazy. And so that never happened. I have to talk about this one delicately, but in terms of Brian Cox, an announcement was made that prematurely, and things came about later that he needed to be replaced. So when he was replaced, now we had to find a new Aslan voice. And so my friend Ned Lott, who was with Disney Character Voices, it came upon him. It was his job now to find the new voice of Aslan. And Ned is very devout, a very devout Christian. And so he told me later he was driving down the street, praying, asking God to show him who should be Aslan. And he stopped at a stoplight. And just at that moment, Liam Neeson's voice came over the radio. And he said, "Oh, that's it." So he contacted Liam, and of course, Liam said yes. That's the origin of how Liam Neeson became the voice of Aslan. So little things like that. But again, you really have to be a producer to have a major impact. So really, my role was relegated to lobbing suggestions here and there, and some of them would get laughed at, and some of them would be listened to.
Oh, man.
Now, you mentioned Passion of the Christ, which had come out just a couple years before Narnia. And I remember watching that as a missionary overseas at the time on, DVD or something, which was a really strange experience to be watching that in a very non-Christian country that I was in at the time. But how had that movie sort of paved the way for Narnia in terms of having like a big budget faith-based film, which Hollywood wasn't really making a lot of at the time? Like, how did that open some eyes or open some opportunities?
They were on very parallel tracks. So I don't know that one opened the door for the other. Passion had a bit of a head start. So The Passion comes out in February of '04, I believe, and Narnia was the following year. So they were already kind of basically running at the same time. I think that Disney, having moved from Narnia or worked on both at the same time, there were just limitations with Disney that, believe it or not, I'm not a huge fan of the first Narnia, the way it came out, and especially even the way it was marketed. Just to give you one example, with The Passion of the Christ, I had about 7 months where I could screen the film for key leaders, including the artists that I produced soundtrack for. So that's a huge lead time that you can do. So we had everybody you can imagine coming into the office. We'd have Rick Warren come in, and people with huge Dave Mustaine of Megadeth, you name it, influencers. So when it came time for Narnia, Disney said, "No, you can't show this movie to anybody. It's a work in progress." And again, it's just an attitude. It's a different attitude. We have to have a humble attitude towards our fans. And so I would say, well, we're not going to get buy-in from people. They're not going to recommend a movie they haven't seen. They're not going to just jump up and down. They have to see it and believe in it and be excited about it. And it was like, nope, no, we don't do that at Disney. We don't screen movies for random people 6 months when it's still in process. And with Mel and The Passion, literally, we would have people come in, and Mel would go, "Hey, should I have more blood or less blood coming out of Jesus' side?" And like a vote in the room. Yeah, I think more, 3 against. It was just fun to watch, him in process. And with Mel, it was, I'm going to paint my masterpiece, but then I'm going to ask people, "Hey, what do you think?" And then they would have suggestions. So you don't want to go too far down that road, or then you're just paint by numbers. But I love the humility and the confidence, frankly. If you're confident in your work, you can listen to people's suggestions and make some changes there. That was a huge inspiration for me in my filmmaking, and even with Reagan, was to, yes, I have my vision, but then you have to be humble enough to go, you know what, I could be a little too close to this work, or the audience isn't following this train of thought here. So anyway, all that to say that with Narnia, there was almost zero of that. And so it really limited and hampered the ability for us to really get the audience fully on board. I think if you see the Rotten Tomatoes numbers, they're not great, they're okay. But for me personally, I wasn't really, I felt like it was a little bit of a movie by committee. Like I could see the outlines of the kids on the hillside. I'm like, really? We spent all this money and I can still see the green screen?
I know the very scene that you're talking about.
Yeah, like, come on, you guys. It's like, this is, not to be a purist here, but with all this money spent, you'd think somebody could go in and just, choo, get rid of that thing. But more fundamentally, I really always questioned, to direct children is a very, very difficult job. And so you want somebody in that director's chair who's directed people before, not to mention children. And so to jump from Shrek to directing, that's a big leap. And so I would have preferred to have the children directed in a better way. I didn't feel the emotion. Sorry to dump on your favorites, but I didn't feel the
this
emotion.
Is all fair. This is all fair, I think.
Yeah, I didn't feel the emotion between Lucy and Aslan, for instance. I forget the scene, but where they have their moment together, and it was almost like Aslan is saying, "Oh, run along," and it's like, come on, you guys, this is a moment of deep, deep affection and love, and it has spiritual implications too. So, all that to say, I think we all make jumps from one genre to another, but to jump from directing animation and computer graphics to jump directing children is a bit of a leap. It would have been nice to have somebody who really had a lot of experience with kids.
Mark, this is all fair. And I think it's something that I have also felt, because I like The Lion, the Witch, and Wardrobe a lot. I like it a lot. And I also know it could have been far worse. But I also had
100%.
just come through the high of the Lord of the Rings film trilogy, and particularly the extended editions. And so my expectations now are through the roof for a book that I had enjoyed long before I had read The Lord of the Rings. And yes, it's a little bit different. Narnia obviously skews younger. But particularly the weight of Aslan and the significance of him, it did feel to me like there had been some push-pull behind the scenes of, no, the Pevensies are the heroes. They need to be the ones that save Narnia. And then maybe Gresham and some others saying, no, the Pevensies are there. And yes, they are heroes, but they are under the paws of the true Aslan, who is really the hero of the story, even though he pops into it every once in a while. And although we want to avoid deus ex machinas, to be faithful to the book and to those themes that Lewis got straight from the scripture, you've got to make Aslan's arrival and his presence, and by the way, his removal from the story, the absolute worst thing that can happen to the story. Oh, great. Now we've got to try to save Narnia without our hero. He's not going to be there. He's gone. So obviously Christians view that with the extra weight of Aslan being not just an allegory for Jesus, but in the story, according to Lewis, actually Jesus. If you can imagine Jesus world hopping like this, almost like he's got roles in different dimensions. And yet it also works for people who are not Christians or who are merely faith curious. But either way, I think I agree. Aslan could have had a lot more weight and significance to him. I felt like maybe there were some folks in the production who struggled with that. It's not necessarily that they didn't want that. Maybe they did. I don't know. You might know. But I think that problem actually got a little bit worse in the later movies, which makes me, by the way, basically an anti-fan of the Dawn Treader movie, because it was all very, very human focused. And by that point, they were working with Fox, by the way, and it was kind of the end of the franchise. Frankly, it was one of my more disappointing experiences in the theaters. And so I was looking forward to seeing what might happen next. And later on, it didn't really get off the ground. But the first movie still holds up really well. Production, with the exception of that scene you mentioned with the little green screen ripple there. What the heck, you had a lot of trust with people coming off of the Lord of the Rings, because there was involvement by Weta Workshop. They were doing the armor. You had Richard Taylor in the behind the scenes, and he's talking about how they got Aslan, like the shape of the lion and the hilt of the sword. And then, oh, look here, we've got the inscription that's direct from the book, which is, when he shakes his mane, we will have spring again. And all of that is just very reassuring. Creatures from Howard Berger, I think his name was, and it was Rhythm and Hues, which got wiped out after their Oscar win for Life of Pi, doing Aslan, the visual effects, which is pretty groundbreaking, and the effects, particularly for that final battle, still hold up pretty well. And by that point, like, all right, Harry Gregson Williams scores pretty good. He's not Howard Shore, but hey, it works, and it's epic enough, and it's not rock and roll. So I'm just along for the ride, and still, like, it's still a favorite every Christmas. Good, but not great. Maybe a future adaptation of the film is yet to come. Still, I it's part of my Christmas season, and then something that I celebrate year round. Well, as we work to chapter 3, I want to pause for sponsor 3, which is a new sponsor for this show, author J.F. Nickens. Speaking of mythological weight and all of that, that's what he's aiming for with this book. Some stories entertain. Myth, Reign of the Immortals, unveils the structure beneath creation itself. The entire first volume in the companion's revelation, shown, spoken, and carried through the witness of Derim. Every vision, every clash, every cosmic truth the reader encounters is what Derim is shown as the veil finally lifts. Derim shall come to witness, the veil shall lift, the cosmos shall bear its truth through me to him, and when the fire of my revelation is burned through all falsehoods, he shall then remember it all, the truth to set her free. That's from The Companion. This is epic fantasy with theological weight, reality, imagination, and love colliding on a cosmic scale. If you're ready for a revelation told through a prophet's eyes, Myth begins here. You can see that cover and more info for Myth, Reign of the Immortals from J.F. Nickens in our show notes for this episode 291. Chapter 3, and into the spring of fan acclaim. So, Mark, I think it's cool that we're looking at this through open eyes. You know, you from behind those early scenes, and then Zach and I as fans, and me as a particularly nitpicky fan. By the way, I forgot to introduce myself. On the Narnia Web Forum, it turns out I was the Most High Reverend Father of the Holy Order of the Spoiler-Free Monastery. After that final trailer, I decided, all right, let's do a little role-playing thing here. I didn't even know that was going to be a thing on the old bulletin boards. And suddenly we have hundreds of fans either swearing allegiance to the monastery and refusing to look at any further marketing for the movie. Thus, we preserve the sacredness of the final revelation in theaters. And then we had other partisans deciding, I'm going to get as many spoilers as I can. And then there was the middle way, which decided that, hey, y'all just goofy. We don't really care one way or the other. So I caused a very fun little battle among the fans there, back when fan battles were fun and wholesome, right? In the mid 2000s there. I did like the teaser for the movie.
Let me talk about that for a second. So Rick and Ned, who I previously mentioned, the two Disney guys, and I were invited to the Biola Media Conference to screen the teaser. And this is, and maybe, I don't know, 6 months before release. We're on the stage, we're talking about the movie, and there's like 500 people in the audience, like full group. We said we're going to show the teaser. And so this is literally in the early days of the internet. I mean, YouTube. We played it, and the people loved it, and they were clapping. And well, this one kid in the front row raises his hand and said, "Can you please play it again?" And we're all just caught up in the moment. We're like, "Oh, sure." The next morning on YouTube is that kid's angle, and there it is on YouTube. For
this
the whole
is
world
the boy
to see.
who did it.
Goodness.
Oh,
Yes.
wow.
So you can imagine I'm fielding angry calls from the president of Walden. They're getting angry calls to the president of Disney. How could you guys do this? And we're at a Christian college. We all just thought, who would do that? Well, some nincompoop had invaded the group. So, it was a little bit of a scandal for that weekend, but we all survived. Nobody got fired. But ever since then, we've been very, very careful with early clips of movies.
Ooh, and this is before smartphones, too. No, there are no smartphone cameras there. It would have been like a digital camera, probably really low quality, but still, I think I remember hearing about that leak, although back in those days, I had really limited access to the interwebs, and I don't think I saw the trailer until it was ready to be shown.
Christian colleges got a bad name after that with movie producers, because we just couldn't trust anybody now, not even the nice Christians. It probably wasn't a student. It was probably a guy from outside. But anyway, that was the guy in the front row with that unique angle of the trailer.
Yeah. Okay. Well, at least you knew who it was, and maybe put his name on a list somewhere. Like, hey, bad faith actor here, dude. Go away.
Yeah. I mean, I mentioned at the time I was living in another country where bootleg DVDs were very common, and every now and then you think you'd buy a normal one, but it turned out to be a guy literally sitting in the chair eating popcorn, taking phone calls. And you're like, what am I watching? Like, I thought this was the real Lord of the Rings. Nope, it's just some guy's camera version of it. So
yeah, it's that guy who hired Seinfeld to shoot movies in the theater. Remember that?
Yeah.
So the film comes out. There was some more trailers, more marketing, all the good stuff. Comes out December 9, 2005. Me and my siblings actually got to see it a week early because there were some pre-screenings available to folks. I think it was actually through Narnia Web. Yeah, so we got to see it the previous weekend. We were there with a bunch of McDonald's employees.
Oh, really? Oh.
Yeah, it was all people from McDonald's who didn't know much about Narnia at all. So we had to drive to a theater in another town, and I almost fell asleep on the way over, but I loved the movie.
By the way, a little bit of, I wouldn't say trivia, but in retrospect, a terrible, terrible time to release this movie. The geniuses at Disney came up with this idea. But, I learned really an important lesson. This is 20 years ago that I wasn't aware of. And so, I thought to myself, well, December 9th, it was chosen, I believe, by Disney with Walden's consultation. But the verdict came down, and I thought, well, that's a fine date. Well, we had just hired a consultant named George Barna to help us with outreach to the faith world. And George said, Mark, that's a terrible day for anybody who goes to church. And I said, well, what's the big deal? December 9th. He goes, think about it. For a church-going person, December until Christmas is the busiest season of your entire church life. You have Christmas pageants, Christmas plays, blah, blah, blah. You're just constantly until Christmas Day. And then your load lightens, and then you can do some things. So I went back to our team, and of course it was too late to change it. But if you watch sometime go to the not IMDb, the other one, Box Office Mojo.
That's the one.
So it's very interesting what happens with Narnia is it opens pretty strong. It falls, so December 9th, 16th, 23rd, drop, drop, drop. 30th goes back to number one and beats King Kong.
There you go. I remember that. Yes.
It was literally what George had told me was going to happen, which is that a church, again, Hollywood is not structured to think about a church-going person's life habits. So we were totally ignorant of it until that moment. So anyway, word of the wise, just don't release any movie expecting the churchgoer to come during that season. They're just too busy. They have other priorities. With all due respect to your little movie, I got a Christmas pageant that my kid's in at the First Baptist Church. I won't be going until after Christmas when I have some time.
There's a lot of practical wisdom there. And by the way, that's probably why Dallas Jenkins last year released the best Christmas pageant ever. Not in December, but in November. Yeah. Nice early clearance, get a little Thanksgiving boost maybe, and then everybody settles into the Christmas grind with their real life commitments.
It's funny. That movie came out right after Naomi and I had gotten married 20 years ago. It was September of that year we got married, and we were traveling for the next several months. And so we ended up seeing Narnia in theaters, I think on release weekend, because we weren't part of like the local church pageant and all that kind of stuff. We were just with friends. And some of those friends were not yet believers. We're still praying for some of those friends. And it was really fun to see what their reactions were. Because, Narnia was being marketed not only to the faith audience, but sort of the fantasy audience, right? The Lord of the Rings fans. And so I'm just curious how you got both of those, groups together at the time. It worked really well in our little group of friends, but I imagine that was a little bit of a push-pull.
I think the key is to really give the audience, to allow them to have their own interpretation and not contradict it. So for the Christian film goer, you watch that and you think Jesus Christ. For the more secular film goer, a cute lion. And you want to allow both to have their path and not be too forceful in pushing an interpretation on people. And that's just and sometimes faith, filmmakers who are Christians or faith, sometimes they just want to ram it home.
Yep.
And I'll give you an example. During the Passion of the Christ screenings, we would have pastors come in to watch the movie, and they would say, Mr. Gibson, can you please put a website or an 800 number where people can get saved at the end of the movie?
No. Don't do that. No, really, don't. I had someone stand up at the end of my screening of Amazing Grace, directed by future Narnia director, I think it was Michael Apted, and someone got up at the end and gave an altar call. And I thought the film was already saturated in these wonderful themes of grace and redemption and, abolishing the slave trade in England by William Wilberforce. You don't have to give the altar call at the end. That's for church. This is movie time. Keep them separate.
Well, this is the first time I've ever heard salvation equated with murder. But Mel said to the preacher, listen, my job is to take people to the edge of the cliff, and your job is to push them over.
He's right. Different jobs, different vocations, storyteller and pastor. They are not the same vocation.
Yeah, and both sides make this mistake, by the way. There was a movie called The Butler, and I really enjoyed The Butler until the last 3 minutes, where it was clear that this was a commercial, an advertisement for the re-election of Barack Obama, or just even his presidency. And I was like, wait a minute, so that's what this is about? Oh, you wanted me to sit through this amazing inspirational story just to get me to be favorable toward Barack Obama? And that's the sort of secular version of what faith-based filmmakers do, which they'll often, you ever notice, sometimes let's say there was an inspirational nugget or two in the film. Sometimes they'll put it over the credits as you're watching the credits. They'll rehash those two. In case you missed it the first time, here it is again over the credits.
Oh.
And it's like, just have enough respect for us as film goers to give us some space. And, just to bring it back to my movie, to Reagan, just to give you an example. There's a scene in the film where a preacher prophesies over younger Governor Reagan that he'll be president one day, 10 years before he actually became president. And so I didn't want to not put that in because I thought it was really interesting. What does it do to a man to be told things like that? people tell you you're going to be president one day. Well, you could have a huge ego or all kinds of. So anyway, I wanted it, but I also wanted my more secular film goer to have an escape route out of that, so that he doesn't have to agree with what he's seeing. So we did the scene, but then I cut to the KGB agents who were saying, "Yeah, you don't believe this, do you?" And then I cut to Nancy Reagan saying, "That's kooky." So that way, you're giving space to a viewer, and don't crowd them so much that they have to either accept it or leave the theater. So that gives a chance for that film goer to go, "Okay, I'm with Nancy and the KGB agents. That's crazy."
Yeah, you've got to have that on screen.
I think within greater evangelicalism, there is a lack of a theology of art and entertainment for its own sake. This idea that beauty and storytelling is like an irreducible value, like you don't have to transform it into a teachable moment. And so I think that's what often drives this. This is something we talk about on the podcast a lot, that we can enjoy a story, that we can enjoy just like we can enjoy a painting or a song for its own thing, and trust God to work through that without having to, like you said, put the website on the screen at the end, or like, here's what this is actually about. But I think it comes from almost like a guilty feeling we have. Like, is it okay just to enjoy this and not try to use it for something? And so it's that thread of pragmatism and almost utilitarianism that invades our thinking. And I don't think that's actually a biblical value. I think that's something else that gets into our heads, where we have to use something rather than enjoy it for God's glory and for its own sake.
Amen.
Just a lack of trust in the power, God's power, the Holy Spirit's power to bring things to mind later. In my Narnia book, I talk about a woman who was Jewish and watched Narnia as a kid, and it wasn't until 30 years later that she kind of connected the dots and figured out. I'll never forget, I have a friend in Japan, actually my real estate agent, who sold me my house. And I remember that she never really understood the gospel, the Christian gospel. I could tell nothing really connected, but she was a huge Narnia fan. And when I explained the characters in Narnia, I could literally see the light bulbs going off in her head, that she connected Jesus with Aslan and the children and all that stuff. And there's some power there. But anyway, yeah, trust that the creator of the universe, who is your employer, knows how to take the things that you've done. And, he's pretty good at that stuff. So yeah, just a little bit of a lighter touch. Let people come to their own conclusions. I mean, I can't think of a better example of the power of storytelling than what the prophet did to David. If the prophet had come in and said, on X day at X hours, you were spotted, making out with Bathsheba. If he brought the case like a prosecutor, David would have just said, off with your head. I don't need to listen to this. But he knew, or he didn't know, but he came with a story. And he allowed David to see his sin outside of his own context in a story about somebody else, which gave him real clarity. Because clearly David could see that was wrong, but he didn't have the defensiveness. He didn't have his defenses up. And then when the prophet says, "You are that man," right? That's the moment, and that's the power of a story to take us outside of our narrative and really see things much more clearly sometimes. So we have a wonderful heritage, in the Bible, whether it's Jesus, whether it's the prophet. And, we should probably embrace it more.
And Mark, as you know, not only Scripture endorses this, but C.S. Lewis endorsed that. He understood that intuitively when he was writing the Chronicles of Narnia. The story began not with some pragmatic ministry committee goal of, we need to say something about Christianity to children. It began with images. He then finds his way to the form, the fairy story that gives it structure, and then only then discovers the greater purpose for this. Hey, maybe I can say something about Christianity to children and to other readers through this story, but it is for the purpose of sneaking past the watchful dragons. And some pastors, bless their hearts, they're used to just putting on the armor and then going clang, 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 and expecting the dragon not to wake up. Well, that's just not how stories work, and it's not how they ought to work. Fortunately, God does work, as you said. He knows what he's doing. And so even despite any the marketing glitches or some green screen relics still left on screen, or a different kind of release window. I mean, shoot, this film could have been $1 billion in another timeline, but in this timeline, it did, against a $180 million budget, earn $745 million worldwide. Not bad. Still not bad. And it did lead to at least one sequel with the Disney partnership, and then a third movie with another distributor. Those movies did earn less, so there's a bit of a sad ending here. That is what happened to that first series of the Chronicles of Narnia. There was an ill-fated attempt to restart with filmmaker Joe Johnston, who directed The Rocketeer and Captain America, The First Avenger, and a few other films. Didn't work, unfortunately. Now, of course, we got Greta Gerwig, who we've already talked about, doing The Magician's Nephew, and we will see how that goes. I hope it somehow goes well, but I suspect it might be a little different from the first time. But in closing, Mark, you've already mentioned the Reagan film, and there's lots more we could ask you about. Maybe we'll have to have you back another time. But where can folks follow your work? And in particular, do you have any other info about what projects are next for you in film or public speaking or music or any of these other things that you have your creative hands in?
Yeah, thanks for asking. I wrote a book called Making Reagan. I would have people tell me along the way, this movie sounds interesting, but the journey of your making it even sounds more interesting because it took 20 years. And so I thought, okay, I'll think about that. So I began kind of writing. And so, I began the book with what started the whole thing, which was getting pulled over for speeding in Illinois and realizing that I was in Ronald Reagan's hometown where I had to appear in court the next day because I was 20 miles over the speed limit. And that's where I begin the book. And that's where I first got the inkling to make the movie. I had 24 hours to kill with my family in Reagan's hometown. And so that's where it kind of got started. But yeah, that's I'm doing a lot of public speaking for that. And then now we're releasing the film around the world. It releases in Europe and Japan in early January. So there's just a lot of work to do there. But I'm developing about 4 or 5 other movies. A couple of them are, rock star movies, biopics. I told them I'd give them the Ronald Reagan treatment. Another is there's a couple of Japan-themed movies. One of them is kind of similar to that Rent-A-Family that I just saw, which I really enjoyed.
Oh, Brendan Fraser, right?
That's right, Brendan Fraser.
Okay.
Yeah. That's my job, is doing a lot of work of getting Reagan over the finish line in various countries around the world. The book, if you get a chance, it's called Making Reagan. It's just a memoir from the producer of the film, which is yours truly. And then, always looking for great stories. I have a podcast, not quite as widespread as your podcast, but debuted the first episode with Gene Simmons of Kiss, who gave me a song for the Reagan movie. And we have a great conversation. And I love to talk to interesting people. And so we had a lot of fun. And so that's kind of where my main work is these days. And you can find me on Instagram and Facebook for the older folks. Would love to connect with your friends.
Awesome. Well, you can find all those links, faithful listener, in the show notes to this episode. And in the meantime, looks like you can find Mark Joseph out there on his chariot chasing the next great film. So, Mark, really grateful that you cleared your busy schedule to join us. It's also a busy holiday season, I'm sure, for you and yours. So all the blessings to you. And we'll look forward to checking back in and seeing what's in your creative future.
Great to hang out with you guys.
Stephen, I'm so glad someone like Mark was at the helm in bringing Narnia to the screen in a way that was a big success overall. Again, and in a world that seems so different than today, when it's just so crazy every time a new film is released. It takes me back to a more optimistic time as it pertains to Hollywood movies. And obviously, a lot of things have changed in other ways, just with the streaming wars and the Netflix wars that are happening right now. And we'll have to talk about that some other time. But to you, our listener, we want to know, how did you first see The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe? Was it on opening weekend when it was kind of a crazy time of Christmas pageants? Was it a few weeks later with family on Christmas or Christmas vacation? Was it on the DVD or was it on a streaming service? So send us a note to podcast@lorehaven.com. Find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or our Discord server. And now I'd like to read a comment from Terry Hamilton, who recalls her origin tale of Narnia. And this was in response to previous episode 289. Terry says, quote, "I found the Narnia series in my school library when I was in 4th grade. And yes, they were in the proper order. It was a watershed moment for me. I bought myself a box set a few years later. Boy, did I look for portals. When I got into a discussion about the book order, I point out The Magician's Nephew is a prequel explaining the backstory of the first book, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, end quote.
Yes, we are publication order partisans here at this podcast and largely at Lorehaven. Different takes on the movie, and I'm okay with The Magician's Nephew being the first movie. I will allow that, actually. I didn't want a remake of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe so soon, even though, as Mark pointed out, and as I agree, the movie could have used some improvements here and there. Certainly about that release window. But I will like to say, for anybody still listening from Walden Media, which is unfortunately now defunct, you're welcome. Because I personally saw the film in theaters 4 times, most of them before Christmas. We made time anyway, and I brought a lot of friends too. And I was a huge, huge fan of this film. And being part of the fandom was, I'd say, even more fun than watching the film itself. Next on Fantastical Truth, we do not celebrate Christmas that way. We don't read those kinds of books. We do not handle, do not taste, do not touch. Ever heard slogans like that from well-meaning Christians? Well, we do know our world is full of rebellion against God's law, but many such people overreact to moral license with this kind of strict imposing of out-of-context or made-up law. Faithful saints will call this legalism, and Christian fantasy fans have seen plenty of this. When that social media pastor rebukes your favorite science fiction, or that relative raises a judgy eyebrow at you at the holiday dinner, how can you respond with grace, truth, and even love for legalists? Well, despite all these rules against stories, we also don't want to have rules for them. I like balancing those fan expectations for movies like The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. We can see their flaws, but we can also see the common grace and even the faithful Christian testimony behind a lot of the people who were making it. So even as we nitpick and certainly lament what might happen for future versions, let's thank God for the good stuff that was put into a film like The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe 20 years ago, as we continue to seek and find Christ's fantastical truth.